Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Icarus and today we're going over the first chapter of Whipping Girl. While my original intention had been to break this book down into 7 parts to make it a little bit more digestible, I realized last time it is entirely impossible for me not to be long-winded, so we're going to go chapter by chapter instead. Also, I apologize for my appearance. This is like first thing in the morning, Icarus, where I've yet to take a shower, so I look like a cockatiel. Chapter 1 is going to go over the different terminology, kind of explaining what they mean and how Serrano plans on using this terminology. And you would think this wouldn't cause any distress, especially because we are remembering this was published in 2007, but there's a couple of things that I do have issue with. We'll start with my end of the chapter notes, and then we'll go through her highlighted sections that I thought were meaningful, and then continue to explain what I was thinking as I was reading and as I'm reading it now. Alright, my notes. Since this is mostly definitions time, it's easier to gloss over a lot of it. It is, once again, weird to be reading gender theory from 2007, holding onto the vestiges of older terminology. Serrano rails against the idea that to be transsexual means you are seeking some sort of medical changes, though in today's context it just means you want to medically transition, not necessarily are able to. I also find myself preferring the term transgender because it de-emphasizes the sex part of things. Her dismissal of Virginia Prince as well as misnaming her is weird, even if it's only in the annotations, and Serrano makes it sound like the term transgender is very new, when it's about as old as she is. Still, she grew up with a lot of changes in the queer community, so she gets a slide from me about how she chooses her terminology. And this chapter is called Coming to Terms with Transgenderism and Transsexuality. It's a fairly short chapter, so hopefully this won't take too long. But my first highlight is a potential problem with the glossary approach to transgender terms that you often find on websites. It gives the impression that all of these transgender-related words and phrases are somehow written in stone, indelibly passed down from generation to generation. My only note there is that that feels weirdly related to the in-spec lesbian discourse that's been happening in this year of our Hellfire 2022. There is another highlighted section that I actually liked because there's no notes on it. Because the physical traits that we often take into account when describing sex are biological in origin, e.g. sex chromosomes, hormones, reproductive systems, genitals, and so forth, there is a tendency to see sex as being a natural aspect of gender. However, that is not quite the case. Cultural expectations and assumptions play a large role in shaping how we determine and consider sex. For example, in our culture, Western culture, such assumptions are very genital-centric. A person's sex is assigned at birth based on the presence or absence of a penis. Thus, our genitals play a far more important role in determining our legal sex than do our chromosomes, which in most cases are actually never examined, or our reproductive capacity. After all, a woman can have a hysterectomy, or a man can have a vasectomy, without changing or nullifying their legal sex. Indeed, the fact that we even have a legal sex demonstrates that society greatly shapes our understanding of sex. And then she goes on to explain that she is going to use the word sex primarily to refer to someone's femaleness or maleness, as well as social and legal classes. Story? And once again, I do agree with her that our understanding of sex really depends culturally. It becomes very interesting to read turf theology trying to decide what makes a woman, and they are doing the exact same thing that they have been railing against, how sex should not be defined by our parts, and yet like I said, they're reducing women to their parts and their reproductive capacity, which is kind of funny because when you think about it, even the legal system doesn't necessarily reduce us to our ability to give babies or not. Alright, there is another part. The far-reaching inclusiveness of the word transgender was purposely designed to accommodate the many gender and sexual minorities who were excluded from the previous feminist and gay rights movements. At the same time, its broadness can be highly problematic in that it often blurs or erases the distinctiveness of its Constitutions. And I write, generally, yes, I can see how this could be a problem, but in practice, we can talk about an individual group or person's needs while tying it back to the overarching issues the trans community has as a whole. And I think this is one of those things where she is not happy with being able to tie trans women specific issues back into the greater community problems. She feels like they're getting dismissed, whereas, and this is a pretty common talking point that I'm seeing in current debate as well, the fact that trans men are trying to talk about their issues and trying to coin terminology around it because we're not allowed to use trans misogyny anymore. They are feeling like we're now dismissing trans women's issues or saying that they're not as important, when in reality trans women's issues oftentimes intersect with trans masc issues, and they, even though they present very differently, they actually kind of fall back under the general continuity of issues that trans people face as a whole. It's basically like if you have a sickness, like if you have the flu, you may not necessarily have all of the symptoms of flu. You may be throwing up and you may have a high fever, but you may not be having the cold chills and you may not have any congestion. Whereas someone else may have the fever and no nausea, but they get really, really dizzy when they stand up. You guys both have the flu, but it is displaying different symptoms. And I feel like Serrano kind of misses the point with that. I don't think I highlighted this part, but there's also a note about how she doesn't like the term transgender because in the 1990s it started meaning more than like a very narrow set of definitions. And this is part of what I say about how she feels very dismissive of the term transgender, because I think that's the only time I see her recognize that this term is fairly old. The rest of the time when I'm reading through her book, it feels like she's talking about this very newfangled term and being very dismissive of it. But it could also be me reading into her words how she seems to feel about gender nonconforming and transgender people who don't necessarily want to go through medical or surgical procedures. So we'll go on to the next one. And this is actually my notes about Virginia Prince. I do read the annotations. It is a little difficult for me to get too deep into some of them because they are related to either website links that are deleted or they're from academic books that I don't currently have access to. So I would love, as I continue to deep dive into queer theory, to be able to eventually discuss this at length. So what I researched about Virginia Prince may not be completely the complete story, but I feel like it's still important to see what I can find in my research and compare that to how she talks about Virginia Prince. And this is the sentence that links to the annotation is, similarly, many transsexuals disavow the term because of its anti-transsexual roots or because they feel that the transgender movement tends to privilege those identities, actions, and appearances that most visibly transgress gender norms. This is something I do remember in early times where when I was first entering the transgender community, there seemed to be a bit of backlash against gender nonconforming, non-binary identities from binary trans people because there was this feeling of co-opting. I also think this is where trans medicalism comes from, and it's a little disheartening to see trans medical rhetoric in Serrano's work because it is so influential on such a wide community of trans people. Though it is also interesting because we're seeing how different trans people can. But it's also interesting because we can also see how different trans people sort of research and take away the different messages that they have from this book. So for me, this reads as the understandable discomfort at change that then slowly led to transmedicalism and true scum and the dismissal of trenders and that sort of thing. You know, trenders. Let's actually read my notes about the annotation. Serrano has an annotation here about Virginia Prince having a disdain for transsexual people. From what it looks like to me, without getting distracted reading other books at the moment, Prince had a firm idea of what a transvestite should be, i.e., a heterosexual male who is cross dressing out of a love for the feminine. This definition excluded gay men and transsexuals, and later, in combination with her other more conservative beliefs, means her ideas eventually went out the window. There is something to note that Serrano not only gives the wrong name in her footnote, Price versus Prince, but she has made the word transgender seem a lot newer than it actually is. Plus, Prince actually destigmatized the idea that transvestites and crossdressers were mentally ill. So even if all of her work wasn't it wasn't up to snuff, she did have some good. Prince being the person who did create the term transgender, and she herself was a trans woman. So continuing Serrano's works from the transgressing gender norm, she continues on. This tendency renders invisible the fact that many of us struggle more with issues related to our physical femaleness or maleness than we do with our expressions of femininity or masculinity. And I wrote, while there's been a lot of pushback on the idea that you need dysphoria slash surgery slash hormones, etc., to be trans, it feels like Serrano is once again forgetting that part of the broader acceptance is in part to help people who do struggle with their physical appearance to be able to accept their bodies. There are tons of trans people who can't transition how they want, be it age, medical problems, financial issues, etc. So, my reaction to her talking about the issues of accepting one's maleness or femaleness is it feels like it's dismissing the whole some people just can't transition. And a huge part of the acceptance of non dysphoric trans people also lies in the idea that you can be dysphoric, but you can learn to accept and even love your body for what it is, as being you are still a male, you are still a female, you are still who you are in your subconscious without necessarily having to make the changes. And I think that's important because it's so easy to get lost in your own dysphoria and your own depression, and the chance of maybe accepting or seeing other queer and trans bodies that look like yours, it helps a lot with the idea that maybe you aren't completely broken. But maybe that's just me. Now here's something that I really struggle with. She's talking about how people try to deal with their subconscious sex, as she calls it. And I use that term already. Basically, when she's saying subconscious sex, she is talking about how a lot of trans people feel like they've been trans their entire life, even if they didn't have the terminology to express it, that it was there from the very beginning. So it was in their subconscious that they are this is their true gender identity, despite what society has told them. So this is talking about handling that subconscious sex. And it says, others may allow their subconscious sex to come to the surface occasionally, for example, either through cross-dressing or role-playing. Still others may come to see themselves as bigendered, having a mixture of both femininity and masculinity, and or femaleness and maleness, gender fluid, moving freely between genders or genderqueer, identifying outside of the male-female gender binary. And those of us who make the choice to live as the sex other than the one we were assigned at birth are commonly called transsexuals. I don't even need to read my notes. I wrote that it feels weird to be reading this, but I just disagree with it entirely. And I don't know how people were talking about gender nonconformity and non-binary identities in 2007, because I was 14 years old at the time and I was deep in my conservative southern white lake town perspective at the time where I didn't even know what the T really meant in LGBT. But this is, by today's standards, really, really gross because it's basically saying bi-gender, gender non-conforming, non-binary, gender queer identities are simply people only partially engaging with their subconscious or true sex or gender identity. And that is gross. It's saying that gender nonconforming, gender queer, non binary identities are actually binary trans people who aren't fully accepting that the fact that they're binary trans. And even though I'm stating all this in a fairly normal tone of voice, it actually pisses me off extensively because it's very dismissive and also quantifiably not true. There are plenty of people who are gender fuck or non-binary who are completely happy in their identities and they feel fulfilled by them. It's not a subconscious repression. It is fully embracing the fact that they don't fit into the conventional gender binary, and they struggle a lot with that because there's a lot more pushback and a lot more invisibility with the non-binary identities than there is for cisgender non-conforming people or binary trans people or even gender non-conforming binary trans people. It's really gross in my opinion, and Serrano just steadily loses modicums of respect that I had for her from when I just knew her as the person who coined transmisogyny while reading through this book. Then she talks about how transgender as an umbrella term kind of allows everyone in, including people who may express gender nonconformity just because it's a comfort or a way to express a side of their personality while still identifying as cis. And I highlight a little part of other people identify as genderqueer because on a purely intellectual level, they question the validity of the binary gender system. And I just wrote, I don't see a problem here. I actually identify as non-binary in some part because I too question the validity of the binary gender system. I am someone who would be a bit of a gender abolitionist if TERFs hadn't completely co-opted and turned that term into something it's not. And I do believe the end goal of feminism should be the complete dismantling of gender roles entirely so that femininity and masculinity are simply facets of how expresses themselves, but we're not going to be there in the next 10 years. We're not even going to be there in the next 50 years. So this is not a dismissal of someone's binary trans identity because I'm also a fairly binary trans man. I don't know, this one just bothered me as someone who identifies as genderqueer and non-binary on a political standpoint as well. Alright, next one. And while this book primarily focuses on transsexuality and more specifically on trans women, as that is my experience and perspective, it is not because I believe that transgender people who are not transsexual are any less important or legitimate. Their expressions of gender are just as valid as mine, and the discrimination they may face as a result of those expressions is just as real. It is also crucial for us to recognize that it is equally valid for a trans person to decide to transition and live as the other sex as it is for them to instead choose to blur gender boundaries and identify themselves outside the gender binary. There is no one right way to be trans. Each of us simply needs to figure out what works best for us and what allows us to best express who we feel we are. And I'm including that partially because I feel like it is a bit contradictory from the idea of not fully engaging with your subconscious sex, but also I want to be as fair as I can with her and show that despite these contradicting claims that she's been giving and how dismissive I feel she is of anybody who isn't a trans woman, i.e. saying in the Trans Manifesto that trans women are the most oppressed sex over all others, she does make an attempt to say that everybody who is expressing being trans in their own ways are valid and they do face struggles. So she does put that caveat in there. I also want to highlight this part because it is the next part because it's talking about transsexuals and her definition of a transsexual. It is common for people to assume that being or becoming a transsexual involves some kind of sex change operation. However, this is not necessarily the case. While some transsexuals undergo numerous medical procedures as part of their physical transitions, others either cannot afford or choose not to undergo such procedures. Indeed, attempts to limit the word transsexual to only those who physically transition is not only classist because of the affordability issue, but objectifying, as it reduces all trans people to the medical procedures that have been carried out on their bodies. For these reasons, I will use the word transsexual to describe anyone who is currently or is working toward living as a member of the sex other than the one that they were assigned at birth, regardless of what procedures they have had. And for me, that lines up very much with how I saw the term transsexual be defined in 2013-2014. So I'm assuming that that term came about, or that specific definition of the term came about from Whipping Girl, because again, I entered the trans community about 7 years after this was published, and we're looking at this about 15 years after this was published. So the fact that transsexual has sort of maintained that same definition throughout so many years is interesting. Also, apologies, I'm touching my nose because Jessica is shedding hair and it gets in my nose and it's itchy. But if I don't pet her, she'll just scream at me, so. Let's see. And my last note is just something that she prefers the term cissexuals. And she mentioned, similarly, people who are not transgender may be described as cisgender. Also, although I'll be using this term less often, since the focus of this book is on transsexual women rather than transgender population as a whole. And it is interesting to me that she's choosing it's interesting to me that she's choosing to use the word cissexual, and when I looked into it, cisgender is actually older. So people were saying cisgender and transsexual people for longer than they were saying cissexual and transsexual people. So that's it for this chapter. Like I said, it's a little easier to go through just because this is more about defining terms and making sure everyone's starting off on the same foot, which is a good thing for someone who's entering this book as a layman and may not necessarily understand the terms that are being had, or as someone who is coming to this book from the future where terms have changed over time, quite drastically in some cases. Overall, my feelings about this chapter are fairly neutral. There are a couple points that I actively dislike, such as the idea that bigender people are only expressing a part of their subconscious sex. Like, I'm not sure how you could take that any other way, and I would love to hear if someone has heard that little snippet that I cut out and has a better faith interpretation, because I'm trying to go into this very good faith and I can't not see that as dismissing people who are not binary. Other than that, I don't really have much else to say about this chapter. Most of it makes sense from the whole how she wants to talk about things in this book, the terminology that was being used, even to the point of 2014. A couple of interesting points with Prince and the idea of using cisgender instead of cissexual and that sort of thing. But that's it for my thoughts today. Like I said, fairly neutral. One really big sticking point, and mostly just an interesting peek into the history of trans terms. Other than that, I will talk to you all tomorrow. Stay safe, stay hydrated, and let's keep discussing this book. I'll talk to you later. Bye.